or pieces of artillery. Yep.
I forgot how much later did you see that thing where they found a World War II bomb? And they like rediscovered it and they thought it was active and so they defused it and all. It's crazy. Like,
Yeah.
It's recent.
Yeah, I remember reading something about that. Yeah, I do. 2 million trucks. That's a lot of trucks, man. 2 million trucks. 17 million rifles. 3 million machine guns. How many have seen Saving Private Ryan? The sergeant, he always carried a machine gun. Most of his troops carried regular rifles, but he had a machine gun. Okay? They had a few of those. 3 million machine guns. And hold on to your hats, 42 billion rounds of ammunition. 42 billion rounds of ammunition were produced in American factories. 300,000 military planes, 100,000 bomber planes, 90,000 tanks, 17,000 armored cars, 100,000 jeeps, 300,000 pieces of artillery, 2 million trucks, 17 million rifles, 3 million machine guns, and 42 billion rounds of ammunition.
About 2 atomic bombs.
Yeah, we'll get to that later. Now, one thing I didn't mention, because they didn't produce these in mass numbers to the point where you'd maybe mention them, but you know, a lot of these military jeeps and trucks and stuff that were left over from World War II were sold to American citizens. You know what the number one thing American citizens bought that were left over from World War II, however, that had to do with vehicles? Nope. Motorcycles. A lot of motorcycles they used motorcycles in World War II, and we'll talk about this later, a lot of motorcycles were purchased, and that's where the first motorcycle groups, leisure groups, developed, which later developed into other type of groups like the Hells Angels and that type of thing, all from motorcycles that were purchased after World War II. If you had a World War II original vintage motorcycle, that'd be worth some money. Okay, so we'll talk about when we get into the 1960s, but a lot of this military equipment, not ammunition and guns and stuff, but jeeps and trucks and those types of things that were left over surplus were sold back to American citizens. Now, it's kind of interesting because were there women fighting in World War II in the field? No, it was men. So somebody had to pick up their bootstraps as far as the factory workers. And women got out of the house, they quit catering to their husbands and their children, so to speak, fixing dinner every night, and they went to work in the factories, which was unusual because women didn't do that much. They stayed at home. Women took a big, big part in World War II. Yep. Yeah, bomber girls. Yeah, that's a good example, bomber girls. So women got out of the house, became workers in factories. So the symbol of the working woman in the factories was a lady by the name of Rosie the Riveter, a fictional person, although there was a lady that actually posed for that poster who just recently died, by the way. Anyway, you have a picture, I gave you that, of Rosie the Riveter. She was a cartoon character of a woman with a polka dot bandana and slacks, wrestling around her rivet gun, used to make airplanes, and stood up and put her muscles up to show that she was giving her part to the American cause. And without the commitment of women in the factories in World War II, it would have been a slippery slope for us to win. We've got to give them a lot of credit. On dress-up day last year, I think it was last year, the year before, Emily Wheeler dressed up as Rosie the Riveter. She looked awesome, looked exactly like her. And Mrs. McDonald did the same year. So it's kind of a symbol of pride for women that you have made your point in World War II, that without the effort of women in World War II working in the factories, we would have been in a world of hurt. There's no question about it. Okay, that'll take us to our last subtopic of this quest material. That's a quiz and a test combo. And that is financing World War II, finance the war. How do we finance this war? We'll tell you, and how much it cost. Now, anybody want to guess the total cost it cost to fight this war? $400 billion. Yeah, $400 billion. Now, let me give you a little bit of statistics here. That was more money than we had spent fighting all the other wars we were involved in from 1789 to 1940. We had not spent 400 billion fighting all the wars. Matter of fact, if you look at our government, we spent doing everything you do in government, wars, everything, to run the government of the United States from 1789 to 1940. Everything we did, $200 billion. We spent twice as much as we spent running the country. From 1789 to 1940, we spent twice as much on World War II. It cost us $200 billion to run the country from 1789 to 1940, including all of the wars. That's to run the country, everything we ever did, and it cost $400 billion to fight a 5-year war from July of 1940 to July of 1945. $400 billion. Now, how did we pay for this? There were two ways this was paid for. Anybody want to give me the easy one?
Bonds.
Well, that was the hard one. So what's easy? How did we pay for this? We taxed our American citizens. Matter of fact, 33% or 132 billion was gained through taxing American citizens. So one way we paid to finance that 400 billion for the war is we taxed people. And 33% of that 400 billion, or 132 billion, we got from taxes. The other 67%, or 268 billion, as you mentioned, came from the selling of war bonds. We'll talk about that in a minute. So taxes, 33% of the money, 132 billion. War bonds, 67% of the money, 268 billion. Now, talk about war bonds. Sold them before, right? They sold them in the Revolutionary War. You guys maybe remember this. God, I hope I'm getting through to you a little bit, but do you remember the little bit of the controversy when they sold the war bonds in the Revolutionary War? Anybody remember the controversy behind that? Yeah, they had to make arrangements, but they were going to. But who didn't Congress want to pay war bonds off on? Remember, that was a controversy. You know, that Congress, Alexander Hamilton made it very clear: we owe this money, and we got to pay it back. And if we don't pay it back, you know, we're not going to have the trust of the American people. So they owed foreign debt to foreign countries, which they paid back payments over time. They owed individuals that money from war bonds, but there was a certain group of individuals they didn't want to have to pay back because they thought that they were kind of scummy. Anybody remember that?
Merchants.
No? No?
Land speculators.
Well, it wasn't land speculators at this point, it was money speculators, because what happened is we were getting our butts kicked. You remember there were times that maybe this war wasn't going to be won for the Americans, and they didn't get their money back if we don't win. So these people, these speculators that were gamblers, remember they bought up those war bonds from those people for like half what they were worth or less, taking a gamble that they would win and make a bunch of money, and these other people thinking, man, I got, you know, $100 lined up in this war bond, and we're getting our butts kicked. I'll take 50 and not lose the whole thing. Well, remember, Congress said, we're not paying those raunchy buggers. They took advantage of people in a weak time, but remember, Alexander Hamilton said, no, we're going to pay them back, and they did. And the other debts we owed were state debts, remember, where the southern states didn't have any debt, the northern debts had debt, and Alexander Hamilton thought we should pay that off, and they said that's BS, and so they made a deal called the Assumption Bill, and the South agreed to pay off the North's debts if they moved the capital from the north to, first of all, to Philadelphia for 10 years while they could build Washington, D.C., and then to D.C., remember? Okay, that will kind of give you a refresh there. But on these war bonds, it was the same philosophy. People bought war bonds. Now you think about the commitment of American people. $268 billion that Americans loaned the government, hoping to get paid back if we won. You know, no guarantee, but we ended up. Pretty big commitment, right? Without that $268 billion, can we fight this war? Are we all talking German or Japanese at this point? I mean, you think about that commitment. Now, I'm going to set you up for a future lecture coming, which is my favorite lecture in a lot of ways. If you look up back at that picture in the back, you see the famous Pulitzer Prize picture of U.S. Marines hoisting the flag at Mount Suribachi on the island of Iwo Jima. You've probably all seen that before. Well, that was an interesting story because that was just one day of a several-week battle. So the battle just didn't quit when they raised the flag. It went on for a long time. Those Marines that were in the picture continued to fight. And when Franklin Roosevelt got the word and saw that picture, which it didn't happen overnight, right? He said, my God, we got to get those Marines out of the field and back to America because they're heroes. Well, unfortunately, all but 2 were killed from the time the flag was raised until he wanted to get them back, until they found them. Okay? And they found them and brought the 2 back. What did those 2 do? John Bradley and Ira Hayes, what did they do the rest of their term? They went around and campaigned to sell war bonds. Now don't quote me on this because I don't have it top of my head, but I believe that during their campaign they sold $70 billion worth of war bonds during the time those guys went around. Okay? So that's what they did. Now, I'm going to give you another preview. That happened during World War II, obviously in the Pacific. 70 years later, 70 years later in 2016, the United States Marine Corps finally acknowledged that they had misidentified one of those men for 70 years that was not in the picture. Now let me tell you how that happened. This gives me kind of goosebumps because it's such a great historic story. Clint Eastwood was preparing for his film Flags of Our Fathers. Have you ever heard of it or seen it? Anyway, he asked this guy that was a military historian to make sure that all the uniforms and stuff he had were authentic looking, because he wanted this authentic as he could be. So he started studying that picture, for example, and he noticed that John Bradley, who was in the middle of the picture, was a Navy corpsman. He was the only Navy man in the picture. The rest were Marines. Well, when he studied him further and further and tried to match up his uniform, he figured out that the guy in that picture didn't have any Navy on him at all. And he did more research and found out that John Bradley was not even in the picture. That one of the other guys, which I'll tell you later, actually was John Bradley, and another guy that they never even knew about was actually the guy that was actually John Bradley. And John Bradley went around no, so you picture, if you look at the picture, the guy in the middle is not John Bradley, he's someone else. He's the guy next to John Bradley, so to speak. And the guy next to John Bradley now is somebody else. Okay, so John Bradley moves out of the picture, the other guy moves into John Bradley's spot, and a new guy is actually that guy. It took him 70 years to figure that out. I mean, can you imagine going around thinking you were in the picture for 70 years? Or did John Bradley think? Because he died before this revelation was figured out. Now, do you think John Bradley knew he wasn't in the picture? I mean, would you know that if you were in the picture or not? You should, is that what I'm saying? The thing we don't know is there was actually 2 flag raisings at Iwo Jima, and they only took a picture of the second one. They wanted a bigger flag the second time. And so it's a long story in itself, I'll tell you about it. It's a great story. But anyway, John Bradley, who knows? And maybe John Bradley was told, don't say anything, because you ruin the American hero system, don't you? Kind of, they're trying to get war bonds going. I don't know the whole story, but it's a great story, and I look forward to telling you. And we're going to watch a video called The Unknown Flag Raiser at Iwo Jima. It is a tremendous story on how after 70 years they got it right. Now, here's what gives me goosebumps even worse. So, when I take you to Washington, D.C., you're going to see this unbelievable monument to the Iwo Jima Memorial. It's unbelievable. I mean, you can see the veins in the hands. This guy did an unbelievable, and it's huge. It's just huge. You guys' hands probably as big as I am tall. It's just unbelievable. Well, anyway, we went there 2 years ago, not last year, but 2 years ago in 2017, and all of the information plaques were off of the statue area because of what they had discovered. So I was all jacked up about going this year because I wanted to see what they did. We went this year and they're still not replaced. So maybe you guys will be the ones when we get there that'll get to see the new ones. I don't know what they're doing, if they're stalling because they don't have funding or they haven't got it figured out, or they're just, you know what I mean? I don't know if we want to tell the story or what. But they have not changed. They took the old ones down, but the new ones are not up, the information signs. I'm looking forward to getting there. I almost sprint when we get off the subway because I want to get up there and see if they have those signs, you know what I mean, see if they're done. So we'll get a chance to do that. So anyway, war bonds were a big part of this whole thing, and without the selling of war bonds, we have no chance of financing this war, maybe winning. So, all right, so we will have a quest on this quiz test. Review tomorrow. Make sure you're ready for that. And then We'll have the test on Friday. Now you golfers gonna be here tomorrow?
Just till like first period.
Not first grade.
I know.